We are continuing this evening with the third of the five faculties or indriyas. We can also call them the five powers or balas. And we'll talk. I'll just review a little bit. I know some of you weren't here when we started doing this 2 weeks ago, and we'll review a little bit about what these powers and these faculties, or as I like to think of them, capacities, are in these five layers of practice. So I'd like to just introduce our practice tonight with the theme that we're looking at. And I'm going to read to you from this book by Thich Nhat Hanh. It is, interestingly, not just about the Buddha, but it's a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's a wonderful sort of view on Christianity by Thich Nhat Hanh when he was alive. And, there are many people that embody what we call multiple belonging, that come to Buddhist practice or Dharma practice or meditation practice, whatever it may be, from other traditions that they also hold very close to their hearts. So for Buddhists and Christians, this is a really lovely little book. And my father, before he died, he had 3 copies of this. I felt it was a huge victory for a man who was such a profound Christian theologian, a minister and translator his whole life. And I took that as a compliment, because I told him, if you want to know a little bit more about mindfulness and about the things that I'm involved with, this might help as a bridge. So there's another book too that I recommend on this topic called Jesus and Buddha, which was edited by Jack Kornfield and Marcus Borg, who is a Catholic theologian. He wrote a lovely book called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time that I found really helpful as kind of a way to rediscover Christianity about maybe 20 years ago or more. Anyway, so this is a lovely book. But interestingly here, what I'm going to read to you really has nothing to do with sort of Christianity, but it's a way that he describes mindfulness, which he talks about often as looking deeply. He often uses that phrase, looking deeply and touching deeply. And it's one way to define mindfulness. Of course, there are other ways to look at it, but the looking deeply and the touching deeply, the looking and the touching both confer certain qualities in what makes looking deeply and touching deeply mindful. So here is what he writes. Touching deeply is an important practice. We touch with our hands, our eyes, our ears, and also with our mindfulness. The first practice I learned as a novice monk was to breathe in and out consciously, to touch each breath with my mindfulness, identifying the in-breath as in-breath and the out-breath as out-breath. When you practice this way, your mind and body come into full alignment. Your wandering thoughts come to a stop, and you are at your best. Mindfulness is the substance of a Buddha. When you look deeply into this moment, you are able to see the nature of reality. And this insight liberates you from suffering and confusion. Peace, after all, is already there to some extent. The challenge is whether we know how to touch it. Conscious breathing is thus the most basic Buddhist principle for touching peace. And then he continues on by offering the lyrics that we heard in the song at the beginning. Breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I smile. dwelling in the present moment. What a wonderful moment. So, very simple words and a profound gateway at the same time. Yeah. So we hear this word mindfulness in so many contexts, and some of you here on the call have, I know you from the extension school course that you've taken, or courses, which I do every fall on mindfulness, meaning and resilience. That's the name of the class at the Harvard Extension School. And it's wonderful to see you all when you show up regularly like this, having done that course, that you're continuing to explore and nuance and deepen in your own ways and integrate, and this is a big part of it. And one of the things that we look at in that class is just mindfulness as this multi-layered quality. And of course, it can have a formal application, such as formally sitting in what we call mindfulness meditation. But it's also a quality or a state, yeah? It's a naturalness at the heart of our awareness to simply bear witness without judgment, without reactivity, intentionally, yeah, with cognizance, with intention, and with gentle awareness. So that's one way to describe it. And there are other ways. The great John Kabat-Zinn in the mindfulness movement often talks about it as being paying attention on purpose, without judgment in the present moment, or something that approximates that. And that works too. The meaning of the term sati, which is the Pali term for mindfulness, in the Sanskrit, it's smrti. Smrti is Sanskrit, and sati is the Pali. It's often translated as memory or remembering. And yet, it's often the case that people don't understand, well, how does that relate to quality of awareness, or to these things that you just said, Chris, about how we can define it, or to looking deeply. So here's where context matters. And whenever I've done translation work, so I studied Sanskrit in college. I didn't study Pali. But whenever I've done the work of translating, one word can have many meanings. Yeah, like the word citta. There are words that really depend on context to be able to translate them accurately. And so what we do is we don't just go, oh, this equals that. Yeah. But there are a constellation of qualities that also arise in this term sati. And so, yes, it does mean memory, it does mean remembering, but within an ecosystem. The Buddha, in his 10th discourse, his teaching on mindfulness, called the Satipatthana Sutta, is the teaching in the canon, the Buddha's teaching on mindfulness. He says something important in that is often missed by the secular mindfulness movement. One of the very first lines, he says, sati, or mindfulness, is all you need for the cessation of suffering, the abandonment of sorrow, and to realize the ultimate freedom of nirvana, or nibbana. Basically, he's saying, this is all you need to be fully awake. And that is opening up, in many ways, a whole dimension of mind that often isn't talked about in secular mindfulness. So this is a key thing, though, because later in that text, he includes the 7 factors of awakening, basically the end, the fulfillment of the path, if you like. So these terms matter. These terms matter. So we find this concept of mindfulness in many different locations in the teachings of Buddhism. And I find this interesting, that within the four foundations of mindfulness, which is the meaning of the word satipatthana. Satipatthana is foundations, or sort of groundedness as of mindfulness. That part of mindfulness, his mindfulness teaching, is that mindfulness is also part of the Eightfold Path. It is the sixth stage in the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. It is also the first in the seven factors of awakening. It is the third in the indriya that we are looking at, and it is the third power. So how do we make sense of this term when it has so many different applications? What we're seeing is its importance as a comprehensive practice on its own. It also includes the process of insight, of wisdom. So it's not exclusive. It's not just, oh, I'm going to practice so that I can feel better. But rather, it's also a process of looking deeply, in the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, to the nature of suffering, to the way the mind operates, to what else is there besides thoughts, aversions, hindrances. What is holding all of this with a profound presence? What is holding all of this together, if you will, in mind? What is it that collects the mind back to its ultimate source? And so this is the importance of mindfulness and the insight we need to know not only can I practice developing these qualities of awakening and have the confidence that I can do this, but also to know how to do it. So this isn't to be taken lightly in the formal practice of mindfulness. At the same time, it is so basic and intrinsic to who we are that we don't need to practice mindfulness simply sitting on a cushion and trying to quiet the mind. There are four postures that the Buddha talks about. Practice mindfulness when you're sitting in Padmasana, the lotus position, or a chair. We can also bracket that too. Find yourself a place under a tree or in a grove, somewhere quiet, and either sit and practice, or you can stand, basically what in yoga we would call mountain pose or tadasana, standing straight up, and you can meditate standing, or walking. So walking meditation right there in that discourse of the Buddha, and lying down. So we don't need to just be sitting on a cushion and mindfulness only arises here, but rather it arises simply by bearing in mind, bearing witness, remembering to do this, remembering the nature of things, remembering that your life is unfolding itself on a path, remembering that this path is part of a larger field, what we can certainly call the Buddha field or the Dharma dhatu, or the cosmos, whatever it is, that you are part of that entire living, vibrant, dynamic process. Yeah, remembering that your life is finite, remembering that the body will decay, and that illness and death and injury our bodies are subject to these things. So we're remembering a whole host of things, but not just bad things. Yeah, we're remembering the teachings. We are remembering all that serves us well. We are remembering our benefactors. We are remembering the experiences we've had that support us, that give us joy and teach us love. And we're doing all of this in this high acuity, if you will, of mind that is clear and open and present. And in this way, present moment, that is the only place to practice mindfulness. If our mind is drifting into the past, then we're not attuning to what is right here, what is reality in this moment now. If our mind is projecting itself into the future, and we're anxious about something about to happen, or we're excited, we're losing touch with the roots of reality here and now. And when this truth opens up to us, we can begin to practice with the present moment in such an immensely profound way. This is why the formal practice really can help take us further than just simply remembering on a moment-to-moment basis. Now, what that does is the formal practice of meditation, of mindfulness meditation, leaves us with an imprint. It leaves us with a particular quality of mind where we have recognized the underlying nature of our own mind to be naturally aware, to be open and without reactivity, and with equanimity and gentleness. That sense, that inner sense, is why mindfulness is part of these five faculties. So these indriya, or faculties, are basically things that we cultivate, that we attend to with intention and aspiration. So we began 2 weeks ago with shraddha, which is often translated as faith. We did a whole piece on that. The video, I believe I uploaded that if you're interested in going back and watching that. Confidence, trust, faith, and so on. The second one we did last week, virya, is often translated as vigilance, energy, perseverance, but it's also zeal. It's done with passion. It's done with aspiration and interest and connectivity. Yeah. And so the third one here is mindfulness, sati. And it is a capacity that we attend to, we cultivate in the way that the Buddha teaches us on these four foundations. The first one being body itself, breath, breathing in. I call my body, breathing out, I smile. There's a process happening there. Yeah? We're attending to the physical body. And the breath brings awareness deeply into the body and opens our senses to experience the body more fully, while it's also changing the experience of the body. The breath brings awareness, the awareness brings change. And then when we exhale, breathing out, I'm aware of my whole body. Exhaling, I experience my body differently than I do on the inhale. And this notion of breathing out, I smile, I love, because what we're doing is we're recognizing just the simplicity of what is possible with breath. It's not complicated, and it begins to attune, to fine-tune awareness as we breathe. So body is the first foundation, and then the next one goes to feelings, or Vedana. Vedana is the Pali term for feelings. And here we're talking about very sensory-based feelings, such as agitation, feeling calm, feeling restless, and so on. So it's a very sensory-based level of feeling. And then the third foundation that we attend to, mind itself. So that it's cognition, thinking mind, narratives, and even emotions are included in mindfulness of mind. Here, we're not just talking about the brain and cognition, but we're also talking about the states that we call emotions. Now, we can experience emotions definitely as feelings. So there is a bridge there. Don't get too worried about, wow, why are emotions classified in thoughts when the affect of a feeling state or an emotion is also very strong in feelings. So don't worry about that distinction. They're also very much part of the body too. So, and then the fourth foundation is what often is called vipassana. It is the beginning of insights. So mental objects, the fourth foundation, is often translated as mental objects from the word dharmas. It's a terrible translation, in my opinion. What on earth is a mental object? What we're really talking about is a capacity to see the nature of things. And so I prefer to call dharmas insights into the nature of things, now, or just insights, because that is where vipassana, or insight meditation, begins, on that fourth foundation. So anyway, that's just a sort of a quick overview of the text of mindfulness. Um, some other sources that I find interesting in the Abhidharma, which is the great sort of one of the three baskets in Buddhism, the three sort of primary texts. It's the psychology of Buddhism, where you find lists after lists of consciousness states. And there's a lovely book by the German monk Nyanaponika Thera, who wrote a book on Abhidharma many years ago. And he translates it, he acknowledges this notion of memory, but I like the way he talks about it in the context of wholesome consciousness. That's another way. We don't often hear it described that way because so many of us are used to sort of the popular understandings of it. But the point here is wholesome consciousness. Basically, what we bring to a state of suffering or agitation or even a pleasant feeling is something that is generative. He also talks about good consciousness. I'm not such a fan of that because it's a little on the dualistic end of things, good versus bad, but wholesome, beneficial, helpful, instructive. Yeah, these are all terms that I think are perhaps a little bit more, say it a little bit better. Alan Wallace, who's an author and a Dharma teacher, he was also my professor in my undergraduate days. Used to study meditation with him as well. He translates this word sati, translates mindfulness as bearing in mind, that you are holding something in the presence of your own mind, more so than memory. And what I like about that definition too is that it includes everything. It includes memory, but it also includes the reality of the moment. So that's another way that we can look at it. And then from the Mahayana tradition also, which Alan is part of too, if anyone has read Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, or the Bodhisattva way of life is another way that it's talked about. I believe it's chapter 5, where he talks about guarding introspection. Now, this is a text that is really important, central to those of us who really honor and like to practice Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And so this text talks about the perfections, the 6 perfections. And before he ever launches into what these are, he says it is so important for us to guard the doorway to introspection. And here, introspection, he talks about that in terms of insight. In many ways, he's talking about vipassana, or what in Tibetan Buddhism we call vipashyana. Yeah, the capacity now to see, to look deeply, to penetrate the nature of reality with clear, focused, equanimous, and deeply engaged awareness. Yeah. So this is the doorway to introspection, or insight, if you will, is guarded through mindfulness. And so we attend, according to Shantideva, we attend through mindfulness also to guard the woundedness of our own mind. What he's pointing out here is that we are beset by a lot of what we would call nowadays perhaps traumas and emotional pitfalls, habits, ways of thinking, things that lead to suffering and that are kind of the imprints of suffering that then we perpetuate onto others and onto the world. And so he's saying, in order to reduce suffering, we guard introspection, but we also guard the wounds within our own minds. And this is especially true in the presence of those who are very challenging, who we might consider enemies and so on. But guarding introspection relies on mindfulness. Very important part of, he devotes an entire chapter to this. So if you're interested in it, Definitely pick up a copy of Bodhicharya Vatara. Pema Chodron has a wonderful book on this text that is it's a large book and it's very accessible. The way she writes this book, it's a big white book. I don't recall the name, but I have it on my bookshelf somewhere. But it's really good, and she breaks that down as well and talks in a very realistic way about Shantideva as well. So anyway, the point here is actually I think I'm going to read this to you. Where is it? Number 33.33 on page 51. Here it is. So he writes, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas have an unobstructed vision in all directions. Everything is within their presence, and may we stand in front of them. Meditating thus, one seeks to remain filled with a sense of propriety and respect, and repeatedly think of the Buddhas in this way. When mindfulness stands guard at the gate of the mind, introspection arrives naturally. And once it has come, it does not depart again. So what that says is that once we have a deep insight into the nature of things, because of the ground of mindfulness, fertilizing the soil for insight, those insights are deep and they're long-lasting. They become part of our way of seeing. In fact, this is why right mindfulness in the Eightfold Path is directly related to right view and right understanding. It's hard to have a right view without really understanding the role of mindfulness at the heart of all of these teachings and practices. So that's why, back to these five faculties, this is why it's so important as a cultivation and also as a response to the things that arise within us. And once it is cultivated to a point where it becomes part of our view, and it becomes something that is perhaps less effortful, it becomes a bala, a strength, a power. So that's the difference between these two lists of five qualities that are the same in both lists. So here, mindfulness as a faculty involves our cognizance, it involves this process of guarding introspection, and it's a sensory-based process. We're noticing if feelings arise that are pleasant or unpleasant or neither. What is the nature of my thinking, right? We're investigating, and we're also working with it. That there is a concentrative aspect of this. It's basically, we are a work in progress here when we're working with these indriyas. And once it becomes instituted, imprinted in us in some way, it doesn't have to be fully imprinted, but it's now a way that we are in the world. That is where it becomes, it sort of transforms into a bala, a strength or a power. It's a capacity that is now part of who we are. And to be sure, there will be moments we lose it, all of us. And yet it's never far away. We can reclaim sort of the center of mindfulness because we have cultivated it, we've made it part of our view, our right understanding. The last thing I'll say here about this also is that the five indriyas, these five faculties, must be balanced with each other. And if it may be, if you're like me, you're better at maybe one or two of them than the others. Yeah, they come more easily. So, for example, faith, no problem. Mindfulness, no problem. Energy could be a problem there occasionally. And so part of it is that we're working with these five: faith, energy, mindfulness. The fourth one, I didn't mention the last two. Concentrative stillness or samadhi, which is going to be next week. This is a really interesting one, and it's often misunderstood. And then the fifth is wisdom or prajna. or panya in the Pali. And so these five have to be balanced well. They have to be attuned to each other. And the Buddha talks about in what text is that? Samyutta Nikaya, about that these five indriya are like tuning strings on a lute. If any one of them is out of tune, if it's too tight or too loose, it's not going to sound good. Yeah. So they all work together, just like tuned strings when you play a chord on a guitar or a piano or something. That is where they are really in their utmost benefit to us, is when they're mutually balancing. And it is mindfulness that encompasses all the other four indriya. So its importance in this list, right in the middle, is without mindfulness, the others really can't be possible, fully possible. And so it's mindfulness that helps us tune our instrument, if you will. So that's why it's here on this list, one of the reasons. And how then once it becomes a capacity, once it becomes a strength, there is that evenness, there is that right understanding, and there is that knowing the nature of your own mind and knowing the essence of your own mind, knowing the Tathagata at the center, the Tathagata Garbha, this seed of potential becoming. With mindfulness, we can do this, whether it's in the form of chanting the Buddha's name, or practicing what in other traditions we call shamatha practice, or deity meditation, or nundro, the preliminaries, whatever it might be. It's really mindfulness that opens the doorway to these things. So that's what we are being asked to remember in this term sati. And to be watchful when the hindrances seek to sort of pull us into indolence or into hyperactivity or into doubt, the hardest one. Yeah, we talked about doubt during faith a couple of weeks ago. But we're not thrown off the path because of these things. We can sort of see them as they are. You know, there is a process where we're moving from the gross level, what is the most tangibly experienced thing, our physical body, as it is in this moment, and using that as a wonderful anchor for change, for breathing. And then we move to the subtler, the sense faculties, the sense bases. What am I feeling within the body? And then we move into even more subtle places around what are the sort of the subtler aspects of what is called mind. It's not just cognition, but it's experience itself. What am I experiencing? Am I, like, self-talk is another thing. What narrative am I grasping here? As opposed to really finding an anchoring in my body and my breath. And instead of being carried away by restlessness, awakening a sense of gentle, loving kindness to that feeling of restlessness. There's another sense faculty, there's another feeling state that is generative and an antidote, and so on and so forth. And so we learn how to practice in these stages that the Buddha has laid out for us. And there's a good amount of encouragement in there too, because in the 7 factors of awakening, things like mindfulness, dharmas, or insight, investigation of dharmas, energy, joy, equanimity, and so on. It's not just, oh, you have to practice this and feel it. It's notice if you are feeling it, because you may not be. Yeah? And in that case, have the confidence that it's possible to cultivate this, even if you're not feeling it right now. And also then know, how might this be perfected just by development? So considering, okay, what is it that I need to do that might be helpful? It may not be helpful in that moment, but it's just having the confidence to know I can develop this. I do know how, and it'll happen. And those hindrances resolve on their own. It's just when we start fighting, following, or feeding them, these 3 F's, where we get into trouble. And so part of insight is knowing, okay, am I fighting this? Like, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to have this thought. Am I feeding it energy? Like Like, oh yeah, like anger. Anger is asking us constantly to feed it more fuel. It's hard not to. Or am I just following, I've gotten into the back seat of a car and whoever's driving this car takes off and I'm just going helplessly along. Yeah. And it's noticing of those three, um, where am I with this? Because we're changing the relationship to things rather than trying to change the things themselves. That's what mindfulness is trying to teach us. Notice how you're relating to it. It's not about the object as much as it is how you're relating to it. It's a little bit easier in a way. Just pulling attention off a little bit more from the thought, the state of mind, the distracting sound out there when you're trying to practice, and go, okay, it's not about this dog barking, it's about my faculty of hearing, and that's reacting. This is the relationship that I'm cultivating. And in so doing, we're changing our own relationship with our own mind. Yeah. So there's a lot of insight there at the heart of these teachings of Satipatthana, of the mindfulness teaching, um, and why it's also in this first list of the indriya as something we work with, and why then it turns into a capacity, a power, a strength, something that's more enduring, something we feel confident to work with, where now the mind is workable. It's not just, we're not just helpless to the mind, but it's a fertile place to work. In the secular world, mindfulness is practiced without all of the other foundations that go with the cultivation. For example, the precepts, the perfections, the precepts, the understanding of kind of just the larger sphere of Dharma practice. When it's just this sort of stripped down version of it, all that other stuff that helps, the three refuges, yeah, having Sangha, having Dharma, and having a benefactor like the great physician, the Buddha, or other teachers. When it's just that, it's a very lonely, it can be a very isolating experience to practice mindfulness with a therapist and then go home and now you're struggling with it, but you just don't have that breadth of the teachings there to help give you the stability and the fertile soil and the nourishment from different dimensions, yeah, including the faith aspect. So I think that's a very good point. In fact, when Alan Wallace was once asked, what comes after mindfulness? He said, Buddhist mindfulness. Because Buddhist mindfulness, quote unquote, it's not just this thing you do. And I'm not knocking secular mindfulness and what it does for people, how important it is. But it's not the whole package. Yeah. Buddhist mindfulness brings back, reclaims all of the literacy and the foundations and the other tools and just a beautiful array of different teachings and traditions that make up this mosaic, where your life has a chance to be transformed in a much larger way. And most people that I've known that practice mindfulness in a secular way at some point end up diving into the deeper water because they don't have a choice. They start learning, and now it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much here that is speaking to me. And eventually those other things sort of form the ground under them. And that's a wholesome thing. At that point, secular mindfulness has done a wonderful thing.